It began with the sound of knocking, soft, rhythmic, coming from beneath the chapel floor. Father Gabriel thought it was the wind, but the wind doesn't whisper names, and it doesn't cry. The church had been silent for 50 years until he reopened its doors. They said the children were gone. They lied. And tonight, they're still singing the hymn that damned them all.
Chapter 1. Chapter 1. They said the church was empty. The road to St. Aurelia's was more of a scar than a path, a winding, cracked vein of cobblestone that vanished beneath fog the color of ash. The countryside had grown silent around it. Even the birds seemed to avoid the trees that leaned too close to the chapel's shadow. Father Gabriel's car sputtered as it climbed the last hill. He cut the engine near the broken gate and stepped out into the chill. The air smelled of rain, rust, and something older, the faint sweetness of burned wood. The chapel rose before him, half devoured by ivy, its steeple twisted slightly to one side like a bent finger pointing at the clouds. Faded carvings of angels lined the stone archway, their faces melted by time, their eyes hollow. He stood for a long moment, hands clasped behind his back, staring up at the iron cross that had somehow resisted rust. It looked less like a symbol of salvation and more like a nail pinning the place to the earth. He whispered to himself, almost out of habit, In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. The wind did not answer. The village lay about 2 miles below the hill. He had stopped there earlier that morning, hoping to speak with a few locals, to learn why St. Aurelia's had remained closed for nearly 50 years. No one wanted to talk. At the small cafe near the square, the innkeeper had simply stared at his clerical collar and muttered, "That place is tired, Father. Let it rest." Another man, older, with hands that trembled from either cold or memory, refused to meet his eyes. "If you open those doors again, don't ring the bell, not the 13th one." When he asked what he meant, the man just crossed himself and walked away. He'd laughed then, softly. Superstition was always thickest in small towns, he told himself. He'd spent his life tending to ruins, spiritually and literally. St. Aurelia's would be no different. The heavy oak doors resisted him when he pushed. The hinges moaned like something waking from a long sleep. Dust poured down in soft clouds. The smell hit him first, wax, mildew, and something faintly metallic. The air was cold, unnaturally so, as if the building had stored winter in its bones. Light fell through broken stained glass windows, scattering colors across the cracked stone floor. Reds bled into blues, forming the distorted shape of a kneeling child where the altar once stood. He set his bag down near the front pew and ran a hand along the nearest bench. The wood was damp. Beneath his touch, carved initials overlapped each other, children's names etched deep with care and desperation. "Abandoned," he murmured, "but not forgotten." The restoration order was clear: cleanse the site, bless the grounds, prepare the chapel for rededication by spring. Gabriel opened his small notebook, listing tasks: roofing, window replacement, altar repair. He paused as a faint sound broke the silence. Tap, tap, tap. It came from somewhere high above, the rafters maybe. He tilted his head, eyes tracing the beams. Dust swirled lazily in the dim light. Then came laughter, soft, brief, like a child stifling a giggle. Gabriel froze. His pulse quickened. "Hello?" His voice echoed against stone. No answer. Only the creak of wood and the faint flutter of something small, perhaps a bird trapped inside.
He smiled, half to chase the unease away. "Wind through the cracks," he said quietly, repeating the phrase the bishop had once told him whenever an old church whispered. "Buildings remember, that's all." Still, the sound lingered, faint but deliberate, as though the air itself was trying not to laugh again. By evening, the fog had crept back up the hill, pressing its fingers against the stained glass. The sun was little more than a smear of amber behind it. Gabriel lit the first candle in the nave. The flame flickered wildly, throwing long shadows that danced across the walls like silhouettes of children playing. He set up his camp cot near the altar. No hotel in the village had wanted to rent him a room. "Better to stay close," he had said to them, trying to sound brave. He sat in silence for a while, reading the chapel's old records by candlelight. The last entry was dated April 12th, 1973. Feast of St. Aurelia. Choir rehearsal complete. Children excited for the midnight mass. Then beneath it, a smudge of ink, almost as if the writer's hand had trembled mid-word. A single phrase followed, written hastily in the margin. "The 13th voice has returned." A sudden gust blew through the chapel. Every candle went out at once. Gabriel inhaled sharply. The darkness was absolute. He reached for his lighter and froze. From somewhere behind the altar came the sound again. Tap, tap, tap. Not random, rhythmic, patient. He swallowed hard, forcing calm into his voice. "Old wood settles," he whispered to himself. Nothing more. But as he turned the lighter's wheel, a voice rose with the flame, a whisper carried through the cold. "Father." He spun around, flame trembling in his hand. Nothing, only rows of empty pews stretching into shadow. Then, just before the lighter clicked out, something moved in the upper balcony. A brief shape, small, pale, watching. When the darkness swallowed it again, Gabriel whispered a prayer he hadn't used in years. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a sound like faint laughter, not cruel, not mocking, just waiting.
Chapter 2. Chapter 2. The Choir That Never Stopped Singing. Morning came gray and reluctant. The fog still clung to the chapel's edges, seeping through the cracks like breath. Father Gabriel woke with a shiver, not from the cold, but from the memory of the voice that had whispered his name in the dark. For a long while, he stayed still, listening. No tapping, no laughter. Only the slow groan of the building settling and the faint rustle of his blankets against the cot. He almost convinced himself he had imagined it. Almost. He lit a candle, its weak glow spilling over the altar. Dust glittered in the light like falling ash. Something caught his eye. The old hymnal, large, leather-bound, its cover warped and blackened by time, sat open in the center of the altar. He frowned. He was certain he'd closed it the night before. He stepped closer, fingertips brushing the brittle pages. The hymn book was open to a song titled Requiem for the Innocent. The notes were written in archaic notation, but the words beneath were clear. Latin verses woven with plea and lament. Domine, accipe vocem nostrum, et noli oblivisci puerum in tenebris. Lord, receive our voice, and do not forget the children in the dark. A thick smear ran across the page, the ink clotted, dark and uneven. It wasn't ink. It was brown, dried long ago, blood faintly crusted into the parchment's texture. Gabriel's throat tightened. "It's impossible," he whispered. "It would have faded decades ago." But it hadn't. The red was still visible, still fresh around the edges. The day passed quietly, or at least appeared to.
Gabriel busied himself cleaning the nave, sweeping dust and fallen plaster, trying to give the place the dignity it once held. He hummed softly to break the silence, though the sound only reminded him how empty the chapel truly was. By afternoon, the wind began to rise, rattling the boarded windows. The candle flames bent as if reacting to a breath too close. And once again he heard it. Faintly beneath the wind, the same melody from the hymn book, a child's voice, soft and distant, holding the note too long. Then another voice joined it, then a third. The choir. Gabriel froze, broom still in hand. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from below. He followed the sound toward the altar. The closer he stepped, the colder the air grew, biting through his clothes. He knelt, pressing his ear to the floorboards. The voices were clearer now, not chaotic but organized, harmonized. 13 distinct tones, all young, all pure, rising and falling in waves of reverent terror. His breath fogged the floorboards. He stood, heart pounding. "There's no cellar here," he said aloud, trying to anchor himself. "It shouldn't be." The sound stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt wrong, too quiet, as if the whole world was holding its breath. That night, Gabriel set up his recorder. He placed it on the pulpit, pressed record, and began evening prayer. His voice echoed softly through the chapel. He prayed for the children lost to the fire, for the souls unburied, for the fear that still lingered. Each word felt heavy, swallowed by the room before it could reach the ceiling. Halfway through the litany, his candle flickered. The flame bent toward the altar, not away. Then came the sound again, low beneath the floorboards, the same hymn, Requiem for the Innocent. This time it wasn't faint, it was loud enough to vibrate the air. Gabriel's voice broke mid-prayer. His recorder's red light blinked steadily in the dark. He forced himself to finish the blessing, hands trembling. Et lux perpetua luceat eis. And the moment the last word left his lips, the choir fell silent. He exhaled shakily and turned off the recorder. "Old echoes," he whispered, though he didn't believe it. "Old stones remembering old voices." But the unease refused to fade. Later, when he played the tape back, the prayer began as expected, his voice low and steady. Then, about a minute in, something shifted. Behind his words, another voice echoed, not quite in sync, just slightly behind him, repeating each line. At first he thought it was feedback, then he realized the other voice wasn't his. It was higher, younger. The repetition continued. His prayer is repeated by someone else word for word until both voices blurred together. And then, after the Amen, the child's voice whispered something new, something not in Latin, something not in prayer. It said, "We never stopped singing, Father." The recording ended with a faint sound, the creak of a door, then a giggle far away but clear. Gabriel sat alone in the dark, the candle burned down to a stub. He told himself it was a trick of the tape, old audio warping, strange harmonics, nothing supernatural. But his gaze drifted toward the altar, toward that open hymn book waiting for him in the faint light. The same page, the same bloody smear. This time, the writing beneath the notes had changed. He could see it clearly, though he hadn't touched it. A single new line scrawled beneath the hymn, written in fresh crimson. "Sing with us." The candle hissed, guttered, and went out. In the darkness, the choir began again. soft, gentle, unbearably beautiful. And somewhere deep below, the 13th voice started to hum.
Chapter 3. Chapter 3. The Village Forgot for Reason. The mist came early that morning, swallowing the mountains and the roofs of the sleeping village. It clung to Gabriel's coat as he stepped out of the inn, his breath fogging in the air that smelled faintly of ash and wet soil. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, a hollow metallic sound that seemed to echo from underground. He turned toward the source, but the sound died abruptly, as if the fog itself had smothered it. The villagers were already awake, though none met his eyes. They moved slowly, muttering among themselves, clutching rosaries and crossing themselves whenever he passed. Gabriel had seen that look before, not of superstition, but of exhaustion, the kind of fear that has roots. He followed the narrow path down to the old well. That's where he found her. Elena. An elderly woman in a black shawl, her hair silver and thin, her hands trembling as she dropped herbs into the water. The scent of rosemary and smoke filled the air. "You shouldn't be here," she said without looking up. Her voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of a warning too often ignored. Gabriel stepped closer. "You know about the orphanage, don't you?" Her eyes darted up to his, sharp and bright despite her years. "We all know. We just stopped saying it aloud." She turned her back to him, tying the herbs with a piece of frayed twine. "You think it's just another story, another ghost tale for your notebook. But listen to me, stranger. They sealed the ground for our sins, not theirs." Gabriel's pen hesitated over his small leather journal. "What do you mean, your sins?" Elena's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. "You'll see soon enough. They always do." She started walking away, then paused. "Stay away from the church. The dead don't forgive, and neither does the land." Later that evening, Gabriel sat in the dim light of his room, the single candle flickering beside a stack of old newspapers he had borrowed from the town's archives. The pages were brittle, their edges burned, the ink faded by time and moisture. He flipped through them carefully. Orphanage fire claims 24 lives. Priest missing amid tragedy. Midnight mass turns to inferno. He read the lines again and again, tracing the words as though repetition could pull meaning from them. The reports were contradictory. Some said the fire started in the chapel, others that it began in the dormitory. But every account agreed on one thing. None of the children were found. No remains, no graves, no closure. As he turned the last page, a charred photograph slipped out. It showed a group of children standing in front of the church, all in identical uniforms, their faces strangely blurred. Behind them, a tall figure in robes, the priest perhaps, held a candle. The flame in the photograph seemed to glow faintly, though there was no reason it should. The candle beside him sputtered, its flame shrinking low. Gabriel looked up, heart thudding. From somewhere beyond the window, he heard faint laughter. Children's laughter, light, echoing, distant. He crossed the room, opening the shutters. Nothing. Just fog. But as the candlelight flickered against the window pane, he saw handprints appear briefly in the condensation. Small handprints,
Then they faded, leaving only streaks of moisture that looked too much like tears. The next day, he returned to the center of the village, notebook in hand. The townsfolk were gathered near the edge of the ruined churchyard, where blackened stones jutted out of the soil like broken teeth. They were arguing quietly, their eyes darting toward the woods where the orphanage once stood. An older man noticed Gabriel and spat on the ground. "You digging into what's buried, stranger? You'll only make it worse." Another, a carpenter, shook his head. "We tried rebuilding it once. 3 times, actually. Each time we laid the foundation, the ground cracked beneath it. Tools vanished overnight. Voices, calling our names. Little voices." He swallowed hard. "After the 3rd time, we stopped trying. Some things don't want to be remembered." Gabriel's pencil slowed. "And no one's gone back since?" The man's eyes darkened. "They went back. They didn't come out." Elena appeared again, her shawl fluttering in the cold wind. She looked at Gabriel, her voice trembling with a mixture of pity and fear. "You think you're different, that the truth will protect you. But the truth is what they want." He frowned. "They?" She pointed toward the blackened hill beyond the trees. "The children. The ones still waiting for the bell to ring." A gust of wind swept through the crowd, carrying with it a faint, metallic sound, the echo of that same buried bell. The villagers froze. No one spoke. And then, one by one, they turned and walked away, leaving Gabriel standing alone at the edge of the cursed ground. He closed his notebook slowly, his breath visible in the cold. Somewhere deep under the soil, something shifted, a low groan like wood under strain, or perhaps a door opening. Gabriel whispered to himself, almost involuntarily, "They sealed the ground for our sins, not theirs." The words tasted like ash. And for the first time since arriving, he realized what Elena had meant. The village hadn't forgotten the orphanage. They were trying to make sure no one remembered it again.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. Beneath the cross, there are bones. The morning after the villagers' warning was colder than any before. The mist no longer drifted. It clung, heavy and unmoving, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The church ruins stood at the edge of it all, a skeleton of black stone and silence. Gabriel stood there alone, one hand brushing the weathered stone of the chapel wall. The air was colder near the church, unnaturally so. Frost clung to the blackened beams, though the sun had long risen. He knelt near the broken altar. Charred wood, warped nails, and remnants of wax candles fused to the floor. The faint scent of incense lingered, old, sour, like smoke that never left. He began clearing debris, piece by piece. His fingers brushed against uneven stone, not part of the floor, but something beneath it. He stopped. A hollow sound answered when he knocked. Gabriel set his lantern beside him and brushed away the soot. Beneath the ruined boards lay a seam, faint but deliberate. A rectangle carved into the stone itself. A trapdoor. Hours passed. The sun climbed, then hid again behind clouds that didn't move.
When Gabriel finally pried the stone loose, the air that escaped was wrong. It hissed softly, like breath escaping a mouth that had been closed too long. The scent struck him immediately. The unmistakable blend of damp earth, rot, and incense. The kind of smell that carries memories. He lowered the lantern. A narrow staircase spiraled downward, swallowed by shadow. The walls were carved from stone, slick with moisture. Strange markings ran along them. Faint lines, crosses, circles, carved with devotion or desperation. Gabriel hesitated at the top step. His breath clouded the air, trembling in the lantern light. Then he descended. The deeper he went, the more the air thickened. The world above disappeared, replaced by the faint drip of water and the soft rustle of something unseen. The walls told a story. Symbols of penance. Tiny hands carved into the stone. Words, Latin phrases he couldn't fully read, though one repeated again and again. Miserere nobis. Have mercy on us. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a chamber. The light from his lantern flickered, catching on dozens of melted candles, some still upright, some collapsed into shapeless wax. The smell of smoke lingered, though none had burned for decades. Then he saw them. Small shoes scattered across the floor, coated in dust and ash. He picked one up. The leather was stiff, cracked. Inside, he found a name carved faintly into heel. A child's name. He whispered it aloud, almost reverently. Lucia. The name echoed softly through the chamber. He set the shoe down, and that's when he noticed the center of the room. 13 crosses, arranged perfectly in a circle, each blackened and charred and tipped forward as though bowing toward the middle. Gabriel approached cautiously. His lantern trembled as if afraid to reveal what lay within. At the center was a mound of ash, just ash. But beneath it, faintly, something white. He knelt, brushing the ashes aside. Bones, tiny ones. For a long time he didn't move. The world seemed to hum faintly, as if vibrating at a frequency too low for his ears. He could feel it, not in the sound, but in his chest, in the floor beneath his knees. Then from somewhere deep in the stone came a sound, a whisper. Not in words, not yet, just breath. He turned sharply. Nothing. The whisper came again, this time behind him. Then to his left. Then all around. He raised the lantern higher. Shadows twisted on the walls, moving when he didn't. Who's there? No answer. Only the faint hiss of breath, followed by the soft, unmistakable sound of bare feet brushing across stone. He took a step back, the light trembling in his hand. Another step echoed behind him, perfectly synchronized, as though the chamber were mimicking him. Gabriel's pulse pounded in his ears. Show yourself. The whisper stopped. For one blessed moment there was silence. Then the faint sound of a bell, one single hollow note, rang from somewhere below the chamber. The crosses tilted further, creaking softly. The ash shifted at their bases, as though stirred by something beneath it. Gabriel stumbled backward, his boot knocking over a candle. The wick reignited, on its own. He froze. The flame burned blue. And in that cold glow, he saw them. Handprints, small, blackened handprints pressed against the walls, one after another, as if dozens of children had clawed their way out from the stone. The temperature plummeted. Frost bloomed across the crosses, crawling like veins. He turned toward the staircase, but the steps were gone. Only solid wall. The whispers rose again, now clearer, like overlapping voices murmuring prayers through tears. He could make out fragments now. Beneath the cross, they made us kneel for our sins. The lantern flickered. The walls seemed to close in. He backed toward the center, his mind racing. Then suddenly the ground beneath him shifted, a hollow echo. He dropped to one knee, brushing away more ash. Beneath it, a symbol carved deep into the floor. A circle of 13 lines, identical to the cross's arrangement, with a single word in the center. Vinculum. The binding. His hand trembled. He realized what he was standing on wasn't just a floor. It was a seal. A lock. And something below it had just moved. The air shuddered. Every candle flared at once, then went out. Darkness swallowed the room whole. And in that perfect black, he heard again a child's voice, clear and close, whispering right beside his ear. You shouldn't have opened it.
Chapter 5. Chapter 5. They answer when you pray. Night fell over St. Aurelia's chapel like a curtain closing on a forgotten play. No wind, no insects, no movement, only the sound of the church settling, a slow wooden sigh that echoed in its hollow chest. Gabriel sat alone at the altar, a single candle before him. His hands rested on the open Bible, though his eyes had not moved across the page in some time. He had sealed the trapdoor beneath the cross, blocking the descent to the chamber below with heavy stone and prayer. But even now, beneath the words of Scripture, he could hear faint breathing. Children. Their whispers rose and fell in rhythm with his own heartbeat. He tried to tell himself it was memory, exhaustion, the product of too many nights without sleep. But as he began his evening prayer, the air shifted, cold and sweet, like soil freshly turned. He crossed himself and whispered, Pater Noster, qui es in caelis. And from the dark corners of the church, a dozen small voices whispered with him. At first, they only echoed his words, quiet, perfect imitations. Then they began to anticipate him, finishing his sentences before he could. When he paused, they giggled, a soft overlapping sound, neither cruel nor kind, just children. He gripped his rosary tighter. The beads, cold as bone, slipped between his fingers. But then they began to move on their own. The chain coiled like a living thing, tightening around his palm, drawing a single bead against the wooden table. Tap, tap, tap. 3 times, in rhythm, precise and deliberate. His candle flickered in time with it. The flame leaned toward him, then away, as if breathing. Gabriel closed his eyes and whispered again, voice trembling, Deliver them, Lord. Deliver us all. The whispers rose once more, this time not repeating him, but answering, You can't. He left us. We stayed. His eyes flew open. The chapel seemed darker now, as though the candlelight could no longer reach the corners. He tried to speak,
but his throat was dry, the words caught in the hollow of his chest. Then, faintly, he heard something different. Not the children's voices, but his own. A soft whisper, distant but unmistakable. Gabriel. He froze. The sound came from the left pew, the same tone, the same inflection, but younger. Gabriel. Again, this time closer. He turned, the candlelight trembling across the walls. A shadow moved among the pews, small, human-shaped, but translucent, like a memory caught in air. And then he remembered. The parish records, the fire, the children. There had been 14 names, 13 lost in the blaze, and one that survived. Gabriel's hand went still, his mind filled with images he didn't recognize, or perhaps ones he had long buried. Smoke. Screaming. A small boy hiding beneath a pew as flames crawled across the ceiling. He remembered a voice calling him through the smoke, a woman's voice, and the faint music of a hymn still playing on the organ. Then nothing. When he woke in the hospital weeks later, they said he was the sole survivor, the parish's only child spared from the fire of St. Aurelia's chapel. He never returned, until now. The realization hollowed him. He stared at the walls, at the faint handprints that still marked the stone. They weren't just any children's prints. They were his friends. The ones he prayed for every night of his youth. He fell to his knees, tears streaking the dust on his face. I didn't know. I didn't remember. The church seemed to breathe in response, the air pressing down like the weight of a crowd. Then came the laughter again. But this time, it wasn't playful. It was mocking. 1,000 tiny voices layered into one rising tone. Soft, then sharp, then almost musical. They repeated his prayer, word for word, in perfect synchronized rhythm. The Our Father, but twisted. The cadence wrong, the emphasis falling on words that should never be emphasized. Deliver us. Deliver us. Deliver us. The sound filled every corner of the chapel. The walls trembled. Dust fell from the rafters. Gabriel pressed his palms over his ears, but the voices only grew louder, clearer, now speaking inside his head. You left us in the fire. You prayed for yourself. You don't belong up there. The candle before him flared suddenly. Its flame stretched into a thin, unnatural shape, the silhouette of a small figure standing at the altar. A girl, maybe 8 years old, her eyes empty black. Her hair hung wet over her shoulders as though she'd just come from the rain. Gabriel's breath caught. He knew that face. Lucia. The same name carved in the shoe he found below. She tilted her head slowly. We prayed too, Father, but no one came. The temperature dropped. Frost formed along the edge of the altar. He reached out, trembling. I'm here now. The girl smiled faintly, not cruelly, but like someone who knew a truth he couldn't yet face. Then pray again, she whispered. We'll answer this time. Gabriel dropped his gaze. His voice faltered as he began the Lord's Prayer again. This time, when the children's voices joined, he didn't resist. Together, they spoke, one voice, one rhythm, rising like wind through broken glass. By the end, he no longer knew which voice was his. The last line echoed through the chapel, stretched and distorted until it was barely human. Deliver us from evil. And somewhere deep beneath the floor, the stone seal shifted. The faint sound of cracking rock carried up through the silence. The whispers stopped. The candle died. And in the dark, a single word, soft, distant, but unmistakable, rose from below. Amen.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6. The Confession That Was Never Heard. The chapel was silent again. Silent in a way that didn't feel like peace, more like the world was holding its breath. Father Gabriel sat at the altar, head bowed, the rosary broken across the floor like scattered bones. The last word he heard, Amen, still rang faintly in his mind. It wasn't his voice that had spoken it. It came from below. He should have left. He knew that. The rational part of him screamed for it, the part that still believed in the living world. But the deeper voice, the one that had been guiding him since the day he returned, whispered otherwise. You owe them the truth. And truth, he was learning, was rarely merciful. He lit a single candle and placed it near the cracked trapdoor. The air that seeped through was damp and metallic, the scent of iron, old wood, and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. As the flame trembled, so did his hands. Not from fear this time, from recognition. Images pressed against his mind, not visions but memories clawing their way back. He had buried them so deeply he'd convinced himself they weren't real. But now the walls themselves seemed to breathe those moments back into him. He remembered smoke. He remembered running barefoot across burning wood, the soles of his feet searing. He remembered the bells ringing, not to call the faithful, but to warn them. The chapel screaming for help as its roof caved in. And then a voice, a man's voice, strong, commanding, breaking through the chaos. Close the door. They must stay inside. Gabriel shuddered as the sound replayed in his head. Deep, furious, resolute. He could hear the crackle of fire swallowing the words, could feel the heat licking at his back. He saw himself, a small boy in smoke-stained pajamas, clinging to the edge of a pew while others screamed around him. Someone had grabbed him by the arm, dragging him toward the exit. A hand, trembling but firm. A woman's voice whispering, "Run, Gabriel. Don't look back." He hadn't, until now. The candlelight flickered, throwing long shadows that crawled along the walls like memories made flesh. He stood, trembling, and approached the confessional booth at the rear of the chapel, its door half hanging from rusted hinges. He hadn't opened it once since returning. The wood was blackened from the fire, the small lattice window still lined with soot. Something inside him said this was where the truth waited. He pushed the door open. It creaked like a scream that had been waiting 50 years to be heard. Inside, the air was stale, sealed and heavy, and on the seat, covered in a fine layer of dust, sat a small leather-bound journal. It bore the initials F.M., Father Matteo, the same priest whose name had appeared in the parish records, the same man who had been in charge of St. Aurelia when the fire consumed it. Gabriel opened the first page. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was firm. Each word was a confession, written not to God, but to himself. The ritual was not of the church. It was older,
The children were chosen for their innocence, to contain what was beneath the altar. It feeds on purity, on faith. It needed vessels. We gave it 13. Gabriel's hand trembled as he turned the page. The hymn was the key, the song for the dead. Once sung in full, it opens the gate again. We failed. The fire was no accident. It was their offering to close it. I begged for mercy. None came. A small charred corner of paper clung to the edge, half burned, but one line remained legible. One child escaped, the vessel incomplete. The seal is broken. Gabriel felt the blood drain from his face. It was him. He had been the missing piece. The laughter, the whispers, the mimicry, it wasn't haunting. It was summoning. The children weren't the ones trapped beneath the church. They were the locks, and he the key. A gust of wind swept through the chapel, snuffing out the candlelight. Darkness fell like a shroud. Then, the confessional wall creaked. Something moved on the other side. He pressed his ear to the lattice, holding his breath. A faint whisper came through. Not the children's time, a man's. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." He froze. The voice was his own, but older, strained, broken by guilt. I sealed them there. I had to. The thing was already in them. It was already in me. He staggered back, trembling. The confessional door began to shake violently, hinges shrieking. He stumbled away as the wood splintered, the faint outline of a hand pressing from the inside, not a child's hand, larger, heavier, a man's. The voice continued, rising, echoing through the chapel now from every direction. They screamed, Gabriel. They begged me to stop the fire. I told them the flames would cleanse them, but it lied. Gabriel's pulse thundered. He could hear the heartbeat in his ears. The walls pulsed with sound, the hymn faint at first, then building, sung by unseen mouths. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as memories bled into each other. The orphanage, the ritual, the faces of children disappearing in the smoke. He remembered the priest's face now. Father Matteo, eyes wide open with terror, whispering as the ceiling collapsed. "Forgive me, Gabriel. You were the 13th. He screamed, the sound lost beneath the choir that now filled the entire church. Every voice sang the same melody, the one from the hymn book, the one marked in blood. Each note vibrated through his bones. The trapdoor below cracked open again. A light glowed from beneath, not divine, but raw and molten, like the reflection of fire on water. Gabriel could feel something awakening beneath the floor. The voices stopped. Then, in the stillness, one final whisper escaped the confessional. Low, calm, certain. Your confession has been heard. And then, the silence broke with a sound like stone splitting. The floor buckled. The candlelight from below rose in a sudden flare. Gabriel stumbled backward, eyes wide. Something beneath St. Aurelia was no longer sleeping.
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7. The 13th bell never rang. Night had settled thick over St. Aurelia's chapel, a darkness so complete it seemed to press against the glass of the stained windows, swallowing the candlelight from within. Gabriel stood before the altar, his hands trembling as he adjusted the brass candlesticks. He had spent 6 nights praying, begging, whispering hymns for the souls below the floor. But tonight, the silence felt wrong. The air carried a strange hum, a pulse, faint but steady, like the heartbeat of the chapel itself.
The organ pipes moaned softly as if exhaling in their sleep. And then came the sound that would never leave him. The first bell tolled. Its echo rolled through the rafters, deep and hollow. Then the second. It was the same every night, 12 bells, marking midnight. But this time, Gabriel counted each one with the precision of a man already afraid of what might come next. 10, 11, he whispered. The 12th bell struck, shaking dust loose from the ceiling beams. The echo hung for a moment, stretching too long, too heavy, and then faded. Silence. And then, impossibly, 13. The bell sounded again. The tone was wrong, sharp, fractured, as though struck from inside the metal by something clawing to get out. Gabriel froze, breath caught in his throat. Bells don't ring themselves. He turned toward the belfry ladder. Its wooden rungs loomed above him, reaching into darkness. "Who's there?" His voice broke. The air did not return the sound. It swallowed it whole. The 13th toll still hung in the air like smoke. Then came the hymn. At first faint, only a murmur, a child's humming beneath the floorboards. The melody was familiar. He had sung it as a boy. Domine, adiuva me. Lord, help me. He knelt, pressing his ear to the cold stone. Beneath the chapel, something was singing. Not children, something using their voices. The choir grew louder, weaving through the empty pews, climbing the cracked walls. The air shimmered as if the sound itself were alive. Every candle bent backward, flames stretching toward the door to the crypt. Gabriel's rosary burned cold in his palm. He tried to speak, to pray, but the words died halfway up his throat, replaced by the echo of laughter. The sound came from everywhere, between the pews, from under the altar, behind the confessional booth. The laughter of children layered over itself, dozens, hundreds, until it no longer sounded human at all. And then the windows shattered inward. A rush of icy wind filled the chapel, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and burnt incense. The candles blew out. The moonlight bled through the broken glass, casting shifting shadows along the floor. He saw movement, shapes, small, crawling, pulling themselves out from under the pews. They weren't solid, but not quite smoke either. Outlines of what once were children, hollow-eyed, mouths frozen mid-song. Their lips moved in unison. "Sing with us, Father." Gabriel stumbled backward, clutching his cross. "In the name of the words stopped as the air turned heavy. His voice was no longer his. Each breath felt borrowed. The hymn wrapped around him like a noose. One of the shadows reached him, not with hands, but with memory. He saw flashes behind his eyes. A boy crying in a burning dormitory, priests barring the door, a child's hand pressed to stained glass as flames licked the walls. He saw himself, the 13th child, the one who had escaped. The bell above screamed again, not ringing, but screaming, a jagged metallic wail that split the chapel. Dust fell in sheets from the ceiling as the sound rolled like thunder. Gabriel's knees buckled. He dropped the cross. It hit the stone and cracked. The children's shapes circled him, faster, faster, their whispers a blur. "You forgot us. You prayed for yourself. You left the door open." He covered his ears, but the sound pressed through his skull.
He could feel the vibration behind his eyes, like something crawling beneath the bone. Then, as quickly as it had risen, the noise stopped. The chapel stood still again. The cold air carried no breath, no voice. Only the echo of the 13th bell, soft, fading. Gabriel opened his eyes. Every pew was empty. The altar cloth hung torn, fluttering slightly, though the air was dead. But the hymn was still there. Not in the air, but in him. He exhaled, and it came out as song. Soft, broken, familiar. And somewhere deep below, in the dark chamber beneath the cross, 13 shadows sang back in perfect harmony.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. What was buried wants to be remembered. Morning came reluctantly to St. Aurelia's Hill. The sky was gray, the air swollen with fog that rolled in from the graveyard like a tide. The chapel stood open, its doors yawning wide, the bell above trembling in the wind as though still recovering from the night's violence. Gabriel hadn't slept. He sat on the cold steps, his cassock torn, his hands blistered from gripping the cross. The hymn still lingered inside him, whispering the names he didn't remember, names that had once been his companions in the orphanage fire. He could still hear the 13th bell. Behind him, the sound of shoes scraping on stone. "Elena," he rasped without turning. The old woman emerged from the mist like a memory given flesh. Her shawl was pulled tight, her eyes red-shot. She looked smaller now, not the confident caretaker he had met weeks ago, but something fragile, almost childlike. "You knew," Gabriel said, voice trembling between fury and grief. "You knew what was beneath this place." Elena didn't answer. She stepped past him into the chapel. Her hand brushed the broken door as though greeting a ghost. "I told you to let the church rest, but you kept digging." Gabriel followed her inside. The pews were splintered, the altar cloth torn. Shards of colored glass littered the floor like frozen tears. He could see the marks in the dust where the shapes had crawled. "I heard them, the children. They were calling to me." Elena stopped at the altar. Her fingers traced the edge of the stone, pausing at the cracks that had begun to widen overnight. "They remember you," she said softly. "They always did." Gabriel blinked. "Remember me? I was only a child." Her gaze lifted. "You weren't just a child, Father. You were the child, the one the ritual spared." The air seemed to collapse between them. Elena's voice wavered as she began to speak, the confession spilling out like water from a long-sealed well. "Years ago, there was an orphanage near this hill. It was run by our order. We cared for the abandoned, the forgotten. But one winter, a sickness came. It changed them, Gabriel. The children began to speak in voices not their own. They sang songs they had never learned. They knew things none of us had told them." Her hands shook. One of them, a boy, would stand before the crucifix and laugh. He said the church was his house now.
Gabriel's stomach turned cold. A demon. Yes, she breathed, or something older. We didn't know its name, only that it had found its way into their hearts. Elena closed her eyes. So the priests came, and we were told to perform a ritual, to bind the evil beneath the church. But to seal it, innocent souls were needed. They said it was mercy, that their purity would cage the darkness. Her words broke. We locked the doors. We prayed as the fire began. Gabriel's knees weakened. His mind flashed, a corridor of smoke, a hand pulling him through a broken window, a woman screaming, "Close the door!" "You left them," he said hoarsely. "You burned them alive." Elena's tears fell silently. "We saved the world from what they became." Silence. The candles trembled, though no wind moved. Gabriel took a step closer. "And me?" he asked. She looked at him then, and her eyes held nothing but guilt. "You were outside when it happened. You weren't supposed to live, but you bore the mark, the connection. They chose you as their voice." "Their voice," he repeated. His reflection in the cracked glass flickered. For a heartbeat, it wasn't his face at all, but something darker, smiling faintly. Elena reached for his hand. "When you opened this church, when you prayed for them by name, you undid everything." The seal broke. A low groan echoed beneath their feet, like stone bending under pressure. Dust sifted from the rafters. "The seal?" he whispered. She nodded. "They were never meant to rest. They were the guardians, holding it back. And now—" A sound cut her off, faint at first, then growing louder. A slow, rhythmic tapping from beneath the altar, like fingernails on wood. Both froze. Then a whisper came, soft as breath against their ears. "Father, Father, we're still here." Elena backed away. "No, no, they can't." The floor cracked open with a sudden deafening snap. Smoke, thick, black, alive, poured upward, twisting through the chapel like ink in water. From within it, shapes began to form, the faint outlines of small bodies, heads bowed in prayer, but behind them something taller moved, something wearing their shadows like a cloak. Gabriel could feel it smile. Elena screamed a prayer, voice breaking into sobs. "It's awake! Gabriel, run!" But Gabriel didn't move. His voice came out low, hollow, not his own. It was never asleep. The bell above them shuddered violently, though no rope pulled it. The 13th tone began again, long, sharp, final, and as it rang, the ground beneath the altar split wide open, revealing a blackness that breathed. The hymn returned, and this time, Gabriel sang with it.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 9. The Hymn of the Hollow. The chapel was no longer a building. It was alive. Walls rippled as if breathing, the paint cracking in veins like veins beneath pale skin. The air was thick and warm, carrying the scent of iron and scorched wood. Each step Gabriel took on the stone floor felt like sinking into flesh. The pews moaned under invisible weight, bending toward the altar as though drawn by some magnetic sorrow. From beneath the cracked floorboards, the hymn began again, not in fragments, not in whispers,
but in a chorus that devoured sound itself. It was the children. And yet, it wasn't. Their voices had merged, stretched, warped into a single wailing scream, a thing that carried centuries of grief, anger, and hunger. Gabriel's heart hammered. He backed toward the altar, eyes wide as the candles flickered and sputtered. The cloth on the altar shivered as if caught in a silent storm. Dark liquid pooled across the stone, spreading like spilled ink, or worse, blood. He leaned closer, seeing the surface ripple with faces, mouths moving in silent prayer that turned to screams when he blinked. The shadows moved. Small, childlike shapes skittered across the floor, climbing the walls, scaling the pews like insects. Their hollow eyes followed him wherever he turned. And behind them, the entity. He could feel it before he saw it, a presence so ancient and heavy that the air itself seemed to bend under its weight. It wore the outlines of the children's bodies like a cloak, their screams feeding it, shaping it. The darkness whispered in his ear, "Finish it, or be finished." He stumbled backward, tripping over a pew. The hymn rose louder, pressing against his chest, clawing into his lungs. Every candle blew out, every shadow pressed in. His mind spun. There was only one choice. The ritual, the same ritual that had imprisoned the children for decades. And yet this time, it would demand more, his own soul. He fell to his knees before the altar, hands clasped, voice shaking as he began the hymn. At first, it was a whisper, a fragile thread of sound against the roaring choir. But as he continued, his voice grew, faltering, cracking, rising until it matched the cadence of the shadows. The air vibrated with tension. The walls pulsed harder. The altar bled faster. Faces pressed through the liquid on the stone, mouths screaming as the sound of the hymn overpowered them. Gabriel's throat burned. His knees were raw against the floor. He saw flashes of memory, the fire, the screaming priests, the locked doors, the children's laughter. His own childhood voice echoed back at him from the shadows. "Sing with us," he sang louder. The shadows writhed, twisting in pain, their forms breaking apart and reforming, feeding on the melody. They clawed at the air, at each other, at him. Yet the hymn held them. Time lost meaning. Hours passed, or perhaps seconds. The walls beat like drums. The altar bled, swelled, and contracted like a living heart. The children's scream turned into 1,000 tiny cries, each one demanding release, each one imploring him to stop or continue. Gabriel felt the pull. The entity reached for him through the hymn, tugging at his soul, trying to merge with him. His hand slipped on the altar. The rosary rattled against the stone. And still he sang. With every note, every word, he poured himself into the sound. The chapel groaned under the strain. The shadows began to falter, their shapes flickering, their chorus splintering. Light returned in faint flickers, searing through cracks in the walls, cutting the darkness. He was trembling, broken, but resolute. The entity screamed, a sound that would haunt Gabriel forever. It pressed, clawed, begged, but the hymn held steady. The shadows collapsed inward, dissolving into black mist. The altar bled one last time, then stilled. The walls relaxed, and then silence.
Gabriel slumped forward onto the altar, voice hoarse, body shaking. The chapel had returned to something resembling stillness. The shadows were gone. The hymn was over. Yet he could feel them. The children. Their souls lingered, freed, whispering gratitude, fading into nothing. But a part of him remained tethered, a faint echo of their song inside his own heart. He knew he had survived, and yet he did not feel relief. Only a solemn understanding. Some doors, once opened, never truly close. He raised his head. Outside, dawn crept over the hill, pale and trembling, filtering through broken glass. The village would never know what had occurred. They would see only an empty chapel, a priest kneeling amid wreckage, and perhaps, if they listened very closely, a faint hymn echoing in the wind. Gabriel whispered a final prayer, not for himself, not for the children, but for the world that would never understand what was buried beneath the cross. And the chapel exhaled.
Chapter 10.
Chapter 10. They're still singing. Dawn arrived reluctantly over St. Aurelia's Hill. The fog hung heavy, refusing to lift, as if mourning the night that had passed. The chapel's outline stood stark against the pale sky, shattered windows, splintered doors, and scorched stone, yet it exuded an unnatural calm, the kind that made the village below avoid looking directly at it. The air carried the scent of smoke, faint and acrid, lingering from the altar that had bled shadows just hours before. Yet there was no sound of movement inside, no footsteps, no rustling of the wind through the broken panes, only silence. Gabriel was gone. Outside, the villagers gathered at a cautious distance, eyes wide, lips pressed into thin lines. They whispered to each other, uncertain if they were witnessing a miracle or the aftermath of madness. Not a soul dared to approach. The church doors, once broken and open, had closed on their own. Heavy wood swung back into place with a decisive finality, locking as if from within. Inside, the chapel was still, or so it seemed. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Then it grew, threading through the cracked stone walls, through the pews and up into the rafters. A child's voice, clear, innocent, haunting, began to sing the hymn. The villagers froze, straining to hear, though the sound did not carry outward. It was as if the chapel itself had swallowed the music, keeping it alive only within. And then, beneath it, another voice joined, deeper, tremulous, unmistakable, Gabriel's. They were singing together. The melody rose, slow, deliberate, echoing through the hollow space beneath the floorboards where the children had once been sealed. The notes were sorrowful, sweet, and terrible all at once. A prayer, a lament, a warning. The altar smoked faintly, curling into spirals like black incense. Shadows moved across the walls, not in menace, but in rhythm, swaying as if the chapel itself were breathing. The hymn pulsed, vibrating in time with the heartbeat of the building. Outside, the wind shifted. The villagers shivered, not from cold, but from a knowing dread.
They understood instinctively that whatever had been unleashed or perhaps preserved in the darkness beneath St. Aurelia had not departed. It had been joined now by the soul of the priest who had dared to summon it. Inside, Gabriel knelt by the altar, though no one could see him. His hands rested on the scorched stone, palms sticky with ash, fingers trembling. His eyes were closed, tears carving silent rivers down his cheeks. Every note he sang wove him tighter into the chapel's hidden world. Every phrase pulled him closer to the children, not in malice, but in shared eternity. The shadows rose from beneath the pews. Small shapes, outlines of children long gone, circled the altar. Their forms flickered, insubstantial yet real, faces frozen in expressions of solemn reverence. The hymn wrapped around them, binding priest and lost souls together in a loop that would never break. The walls groaned, bending slightly as if listening. The air shimmered with heat and the smell of incense, and something older, something ancient and unyielding, a scent that could only belong to the long-forgotten. The smoke lifted from the altar in spirals, revealing glimpses of Gabriel's reflection in the polished stone. Not fully human, not fully priest, but something suspended between life and legend, between the living and the dead. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had no meaning here. Only the hymn persisted, unwavering, eternal. Each note a tether to the past, each pause a reminder that some doors once opened are never truly closed. Outside, the villagers began to whisper again, voices quivering. They spoke of curses, of divine wrath, of miracles and madness. None dared step closer, yet all felt the pull of the song, a subtle ache that reached into the heart even from a distance. The chapel doors remained locked. Inside, the voices continued. A child hummed. Gabriel answered in harmony. Shadows twined and writhed in gentle arcs around the altar. And in that final, silent moment, when the village below dared not breathe, it became clear St. Aurelius Chapel was no longer simply a place of worship. It was a tomb, a sanctuary, a prison, and a home all at once. Gabriel had joined them willingly, bound to the hymn, bound to the children, bound to the eternal pulse of the dark beneath the stone. The sun rose fully over the hill, pale light spilling across the chapel. Yet inside, there was no day, only the endless hymn, the perpetual resonance of voices that would never fade. And somewhere, deep below the altar, the echo of a final note lingered, sweet, sorrowful, everlasting. They're still singing.
Faith is supposed to protect us from the darkness. But what if faith itself is the door that lets it in? Father Gabriel thought he could save them, that he could rewrite the sins of those who came before. But evil doesn't forgive. It remembers. It waits. And every time someone lights a candle in St. Aurelia's chapel, the voices return. 13 small hymns, 1 broken prayer, and a promise that they are still here. If you ever hear children singing where there shouldn't be any, don't pray, don't answer, Just walk away, because once you listen, they'll know your name too.